The Buick Grand National was and still is iconic within the car community. There are tons of articles and videos out there talking about this car. And for good reason, however, many parts are missing from this story. The Grand National didn't just appear out of thin air, obviously, but there's other forgotten turbo Buicks that helped pave the way. These cars are never talked about, and in this episode I wanted to shed some light on them. If this is your first time watching, welcome. If you are returning, I appreciate you coming back. I have chapters in the description to help navigate the video if you are interested in skipping over some context. We all know about Buick. What's on the market from them today is the complete opposite of what their image used to be. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything here, they are all practically junk. There are a few exceptions, but they've been declining for some time now, to be completely honest. There's divisional hierarchy, most say they were second to Cadillac. I say most because in a previous video I asked my audience if Buick is higher than Oldsmobile, and after reading at least 300 comments, not everyone thought so. I would say it was a 70-30 split. Buick was loved by many with their conservative and comfortable cruisers since the early 50s, then came the downsizing crisis in the 70s. Things changed drastically, new emission regulations, gas prices increasing, muscle cars phasing out, detuning. I think a lot of us are familiar with the context of the situation. I personally was not alive during this time, if that wasn't obvious enough, but I've made over a dozen videos that reference the historical situation. I don't think it's necessary to talk about for over 5 minutes. 1976 marks the start of Buick playing around with turbocharging. Before we can really dive into this innovation of the Buick 3.8 V6, there needs to be at least some context addressed. I'll be very brief with this, so don't worry. The original design for the 3.8 started in the early 60s when Buick created a V6 based on the 215 V8. Changes happened here and there, but it was sold to Jeep in 1967. The demand wasn't there and the design wasn't all that perfect. On top of this, the people over at Chevrolet designed an inline 6 that was far more favorable. The demand switched to a versatile, lightweight, inexpensive engine due to the gas crisis. So Buick bought back the design from Jeep in 1974. The little V6 was reworked to be made on the same assembly line as the Buick 350, which then led to making the bore or diameter of each cylinder 3.8 inches. A few years later, more changes were made to help the engine run even smoother. Several variations of the V6 developed, such as the 3-liter in some front-wheel drive 80s models, the 4.1, and of course the Turbo 3.8. In 1976, Buick was to provide the Indianapolis 500 with a pace car. It was also the first to be powered by a V6 engine. This Buick Century would never hit the speed requirements unless changes were made. Well, a turbocharger was added, modified ignition, special spark plugs, modified camshaft, along with some other goodies. The point is, the Buick V6 saw the addition of a turbocharger, it worked out, and a production variant arrived 2 years later. This was a big deal for a few reasons. First, from the domestic market, there was nothing like it. Chrysler and Ford didn't have any production turbos for the public just yet. At least for Ford, the Mustang would be turbocharged in 1979, a year later. I have no idea about Chrysler. I know they were struggling around this time and had a lot of imports in their lineup. Let me know in the comments. Speaking of imports, only a few models had a turbo, such as the Saab 900 and Mercedes 300 SD, but this market was small. Also, to come from Buick is just shocking, and they knew consumers would be skeptical. In the 1978 and 79 Buick sales brochures, there's an entire page dedicated to, turbocharging. We have to remember that the people buying a Buick at least knew were middle-aged, upper-middle-class individuals that were used to big block V8s. So, reassurance was definitely needed for consumers when these turbo Buicks came out. I would think Pontiac would beat Buick to the punch in terms of turbocharging, but I guess not. I should mention, and my gearheads know all about this, but in the 60s, some Corvair models were turbocharged, as was the old Jetfire. The whole Buick line didn't all go turbo, obviously, but it was an option for models that most don't know about. For 1978, there were 2 turbo models, the Regal Sport Coupe and the LeSabre Sport Coupe.
The wizardry of turbocharging, found on just 4 production automobiles in the entire world. 2 are Buicks, the Buick Regal Sport Coupe and LeSabre Sport Coupe. Turbocharging endows these V6 engines with magic, so you get the power you want from the 6 cylinders you need. Turbocharging, from the only American car maker to offer it. Buick, a little science, a little magic.
I'll go ahead and start with the LeSabre, which was the far less popular option. Consumers could opt for the 3.8 turbo only from 1978 until 1980. Mind you that this generation would live up until 1985. Also, only the Sport Coupe could have this option, the wagon, sedan, and base model coupes could not. The package came with black trim around the grille and windows, special emblems and wheels, firmer suspension, and a few interior touches. For 1978, Buick sold around 50,000 LeSabre coupes, with just 3,500 being the Sport. To me, the LeSabre comes off as a more conventional Buick from the time. The name has been around since the 60s, and it does make sense why these didn't sell well. The Regal Sport Coupe, on the other hand, was far more popular and is definitely more associated with turbocharging compared to the LeSabre. For 1979, both the Regal and LeSabre made the same amount of power, 170 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque, compared to 115 horsepower and 190 pound-feet of torque in naturally aspirated models, compared to 170 horsepower and 270 pound-feet of torque in the Buick 350. The Regal would continue to gain power as time went on, 170 to 175 to 180 in 1983 when the Sport Coupe name was changed to the T-Type. I'll come back to the Regal here shortly, but I want to briefly talk about the other turbo Buicks offered. The 6th gen Riviera was introduced in 1979 on GM's front-wheel drive E platform. Sharing this platform were the Eldorado and Tornado. What wasn't shared was that turbo V6. Back then, GM's divisions didn't always share the same engines, a perfect example of this. Additionally, because this was a front-wheel drive platform and the LeSabre and Regal were rear-wheel, adjustments had to be made. The turbocharger was mounted to the back of the intake versus the top, and hangs off the back of the engine versus above. They also made 15 more horses and 20 more foot-pounds of torque because of the Riviera's easier flowing exhaust. 1979 also saw the inclusion of the Riviera S-Type, which received a couple more performance upgrades to base turbo models and are extremely rare. For 1981, the turbo name was renamed T-Type, just like the Regal, and would continue on until 1985 to then be dropped for the new generation. These T-Types didn't really sell all that well. Most people were fine with the standard 4.1 as opposed to the turbo and those old diesels. We are talking a hair over 1,000 T-Types to 64,000 coupes in the Riviera's final year. The turbo option was the most powerful engine with 185 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque in its final year, but buyers didn't really need or care for it all too much. I'll be 100% transparent, the whole reason why I wanted to make this video was because of the Buick Century Turbo Coupe. I thought it was this oddball addition that received the Turbo 3.8 before the Regal, but I couldn't be more off. I had no idea that they slapped this engine in these other models. You just don't see or read anything on them. There's even another G-body, the Monte Carlo, that briefly got this engine as well. Those are super rare and aren't talked about either. So the Century received the Turbo 3.8 a year after the LeSabre and Regal. Not exactly sure why it was late given it's on the same platform as the Regal, but it happened. Here's the thing, the Regal and LeSabre received the engine, but it was confined to one particular model. The Century Coupe and Sedan both got this engine as an option. This means the Century Sedan is the only four-door with the Buick 3.8 turbo. There's not much out there about these turbo Century sedans just because hardly anyone opted in for it. It is also a huge misconception that only coupe models receive the engine. The 1979 Buick sales brochure clearly states coupes and sedans followed by available engines. What do you know, 4-barrel turbo V6. One source says less than 500 were made from 79 to 1980, but no one knows for sure. Still yet to talk about the Century Turbo Coupe, which I will finally now get to. The first thing that catches people's eyes is its looks. Buick's aerodynamic fastback body design was not really liked by the public. It kinda looks like the Chevy Citation, but those came out a year later on a completely different platform. Compared to the earlier Regals, Rivieras, and LeSabres, these Centuries by far had the most change cosmetically. From the outside, we have turbine wheels, special hood ornament, bulged hood, turbo coupe decal on the deck lid, and this hawk graphic on the side. The Buick Skyhawk had a limited edition Roadhawk, and it too received this hawk graphic. Standard in these was a 4-speed automatic, power brakes, sport steering wheel, turbo gauge, and even a unique dual exhaust system. 175 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque in 1979, not too shabby at all given the situation. It's more power than the Turbo Mustangs of the same year. Less than 2,500 of these were sold. The Regal was similar in price and looked a whole lot better, so making a choice wasn't too hard. GM was quick to phase out this slope-back look for the Century and Olds Cutlass Saloon. I believe they're on the market for like 2 years. The looks are growing on me, but when these came out, they were not well received. So those were all the models with the V6 turbo from Buick. Actually, there is one more, but I'll get to it at the end. Okay, so back to the Regal. In 1982, the Grand National debuted with just 215 units made, most of which had the 4.1 V6 that made 125 horsepower, but at least 35 units were based on the Regal Sport, thus they had the Turbo V6. So 1982 is the first year with the Grand National name. After a 1-year hiatus, the Grand National name was back and would live on until 1987. There is so much detail and information I'm leaving out when it comes to the Turbo V6 and the Grand National. Air intercooling, refined sequential fuel injection, stainless steel headers, different transmissions, exhaust upgrades, there's a whole lot. By 1987, the Turbo V6 was up to 245 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque, excluding of course the GNX. Back in 1978, when these engines were first mass-produced, they made 165 horsepower and 285 pound-feet of torque with the 4-barrel carburetor in Regal models. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the biggest boost was because these earlier turbo models were considered hot air turbos while the later ones were intercooled. I provided you all with the basic framework or timeline of Buick's revolutionary Turbo V6. Most people know about the Grand National, the others not so much, and so I wanted to shed some light on them. In terms of reliability, I know these had some issues, especially the earlier models. My mechanics watching, feel free to comment on any information so we can all learn more. I said there's one more model with the 3.8 turbo, that model being the 1989 20th anniversary Turbo Trans Am. Those things came with different heads and stronger internals, boosting power to over 250 horsepower and 340 pound-feet of torque. A few thousand of these were made, and that would conclude the journey of this great engine. That is going to conclude this week's episode. If you did in fact like it, don't forget to leave a like. It continues to motivate me and work even harder. I appreciate you all watching up until this point. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you all next week.